As this process continues, the empath often discovers an unexpected source of strength. The same silence that once felt unbearable slowly begins creating a sense of emotional freedom. They spend less time checking their phone, less time replaying every memory, and less time searching for hidden meanings behind every little thing. Their attention gradually returns to their own life, their personal goals, and their own growth. The relationship no longer takes up every corner of their mind. Meanwhile, the avoidant continues facing the reality created by the absence. The emotional distance that once felt comfortable becomes harder to maintain because there is nothing left to avoid. The relationship is no longer active. There are no ongoing arguments, no expectations, and no emotional demands. There are only memories and reflection has a way of bringing hidden truths to the surface when enough time passes. Both people are now moving through very different emotional experiences. The empath is gaining clarity. The avoidant is beginning to feel the absence. One is learning to let go of an illusion. The other is learning that distance does not always erase a connection. And as these inner changes continue unfolding, the emotional pattern that once defined the relationship begins changing in ways neither person expected. As more time passes, many avoidants enter a stage that almost nobody talks about. This is the point where they begin feeling the emotions they previously spent so much energy avoiding. One of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidance is the belief that they simply do not care. People often assume that because they withdraw, create distance, or struggle to express their feelings, they must not feel deeply. But the reality is often far more complicated. The problem is usually not a lack of emotion. The real issue is what happens when those emotions become too intense. For many avoidants, emotional closeness can activate fears they do not fully understand themselves. The closer someone gets, the more vulnerable they may feel, and the more vulnerable they feel, the stronger their defenses become. As a result, they may pull away, not because they feel nothing, but because they feel more than they know how to manage. During the relationship, these defenses often operate quietly in the background. The avoidant may focus more on problems than on connection. They may focus on independence instead of intimacy. They may notice flaws more easily than strengths. Their attention naturally moves toward anything that helps them create emotional distance. This does not always happen consciously. In many cases, it becomes an automatic survival pattern that developed over many years. The strange part is that once the pressure of the relationship disappears, these defenses can become less active. The emotional alarm that once pushed them away no longer has an immediate situation to react to. There are no expectations waiting for them, no difficult conversations approaching, and no emotional demands creating pressure. The relationship is no longer happening in real time, and that is when old memories can begin feeling safer to access. The avoidant who once focused on all the reasons to pull away may slowly begin thinking about all the reasons they stayed for as long as they did. They may find themselves remembering specific moments without even trying. A conversation can suddenly appear in their mind while they are driving. A memory can surface while they are lying awake at night. A song can unexpectedly remind them of a moment they had almost forgotten. The emotional connection they spent so much time trying to manage begins appearing from a completely different angle. They remember the comfort, not dramatic comfort, not perfect comfort, but the simple comfort of knowing that someone genuinely cared about them. They remember the support that was available during difficult moments. They remember having someone who listened, someone who checked in, and someone who remained present even during periods when they struggled to remain emotionally available themselves. They remember the loyalty, the consistency, the effort, and the patience. They remember all the small things that felt ordinary while the relationship existed, but now seem much more important because of the absence. This stage can be confusing for the avoidant because these emotions often appear much later than expected. While the empath was experiencing the full impact of separation in the beginning, the avoidant may only now be encountering emotions that were delayed. The timeline can feel almost reversed. The empath experienced the shock first. The avoidant begins experiencing deeper reflection later. This is why some avoidants may feel surprisingly emotional months after a relationship ends. By that point, the immediate pressure is gone. Their defensive reactions are quieter. Their mind is no longer focused on managing closeness. Instead, they are left with memories, and memories have a way of showing people what mattered most. Many avoidants begin noticing the emotional value of the relationship only after distance creates enough safety for reflection. The qualities they once took for granted become easier to appreciate. The emotional connection they once struggled to handle becomes easier to miss. The support they once viewed as ordinary becomes easier to recognize as something rare. Ironically, some avoidants may feel emotionally closer to the empath after the separation has already happened. Not because distance creates love, but because distance can remove some of the fear that prevented them from fully experiencing those feelings while the relationship was still available. The person who once felt overwhelming may now feel comforting. The relationship that once triggered anxiety may now feel meaningful. The connection that once created pressure may now feel valuable. This does not automatically mean they will reach out. It does not automatically mean they will change, but it can mean they start looking at the relationship through a completely different lens. Meanwhile, something equally important is happening on the other side. The empath is no longer chasing. For a long time, the emotional balance of the relationship may have revolved around pursuit. The empath reached out first. The empath initiated difficult conversations. The empath tried to repair misunderstandings. The empath searched for solutions. The empath carried much of the emotional responsibility. Without even realizing it, both people became used to these roles. The avoidant expected space, while the empath expected to keep pursuing. The dynamic became familiar, predictable, painful, and yet strangely stable. Then no contact changes everything. The messages stop. The reaching out stops. The emotional effort stops. The empath no longer tries to close the distance every time it appears. The energy that once flowed toward the avoidant suddenly disappears. At first, this change may seem small, but psychologically, it is enormous. The entire foundation of the old relationship begins shifting. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant is no longer reacting to pursuit, and for perhaps the first time, the empath is no longer defining their role through pursuit. Both people are now standing in unfamiliar territory. The old pattern cannot continue in the same way because one side has stopped participating in it. This is where the emotional power dynamic begins to change. Many people misunderstand what this really means. Power is not about control. It is not about winning. It is not about making someone miss you. The real shift happens because dependency begins changing. For a long time, the empath may have depended on the relationship for emotional certainty. They wanted reassurance. They wanted connection. They wanted answers. The avoidant may have depended on the empath in a completely different way. They depended on knowing that the empath was usually available. They depended on the emotional consistency that remained present even during periods of distance. Both people were participating in a system that kept itself alive. Now that system is gone. The empath is forced to face life without chasing. The avoidant is forced to face life without being chased. And that changes everything. Suddenly, both people must stand on their own emotional foundation. There is no familiar dance to return to. There is no repeating cycle providing temporary comfort. There are no predictable roles protecting them from growth. The empath begins learning how to find validation internally instead of always searching for it externally. The avoidant begins learning what absence actually feels like. Both are pushed towards self-confrontation, and self-confrontation is rarely comfortable. The empath may realize how much of their identity became connected to helping, fixing, and rescuing. The avoidant may realize how much of their identity became connected to maintaining distance and emotional control. Neither realization is easy, but both are necessary. Without awareness, old patterns remain hidden, and hidden patterns continue repeating themselves. This is where the future of the connection becomes uncertain. Many people watching videos like this want one specific answer. Will the avoidant come back? It is the question that dominates discussions, comments, and late-night thoughts. People want certainty. People want predictions. People want a guarantee. But that question often distracts from a much more important one. Have either of them actually changed? Because the answer to that question matters far more than whether contact eventually resumes. Consider what happens when two people reunite without growth. The empath returns carrying the same emotional habits. The avoidant returns carrying the same defenses. The relationship feels exciting at first. Hope returns. Optimism returns. The connection feels powerful. For a while, everything seems different. Then slowly, familiar patterns begin resurfacing. The empath starts seeking reassurance. The avoidant starts feeling pressure. The empath starts moving closer. The avoidant starts pulling away. The same cycle that existed before begins recreating itself. Not because either person is bad, not because either person lacks feelings, but because neither person addressed the deeper issues that created the dynamic in the first place. This is why no contact by itself is not a magical solution. Time alone does not create transformation. Distance alone does not create maturity. Silence alone does not create self-awareness. Growth requires something more. It requires reflection. It requires honesty. It requires the willingness to examine uncomfortable truths. The empath may need to understand why they tolerated emotional inconsistency for so long, why they kept chasing, why they ignored their own needs, why they connected their self-worth to someone else's ability to stay close. The avoidant may need to understand why intimacy feels threatening, why vulnerability activates fear, why emotional distance became their preferred strategy, why connection often feels safest when it is no longer immediately available. These are not easy questions, but they are powerful questions because real change begins when people stop focusing only on what the other person did and start examining what patterns they personally brought into the relationship. The empath cannot heal by simply waiting for the avoidant to return. The avoidant cannot grow by simply missing the empath. Both people must confront themselves. Both people must take responsibility for their own emotional development. Only then does the possibility of a different future begin to emerge. Whether that future involves reconciliation or permanent separation becomes secondary, because the greatest transformation is not what happens between them, it is what happens within them. And as both continue moving through this period of silence, reflection, and emotional discovery, the answers they were searching for in each other slowly begin appearing within themselves. This sets the stage for the final truth about what no contact ultimately reveals. When an empath and an avoidant both go no contact, the journey rarely unfolds exactly the way most people expect. The empath usually feels the pain first. The silence feels heavy. The questions feel endless. The loss feels impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the avoidant often feels relief first. The pressure disappears. The distance feels comfortable. The emotional intensity seems finally gone. But as time passes, the story begins to change. The empath slowly starts finding clarity where there was once confusion. They begin seeing the relationship for what it truly was, rather than only what they hoped it could become. They stop chasing answers and start discovering themselves. At the same time, the avoidant begins facing something they may have spent years avoiding: absence, reflection, and emotion. What once felt freeing starts revealing feelings that can no longer remain hidden behind distance. And that is why no contact can be so powerful. Not because it guarantees reconciliation, not because it guarantees closure, and not because it magically changes another person. Its real power comes from revealing the truth about the relationship, the truth about the patterns, and most importantly, the truth about ourselves. Because the moment an empath stops chasing and the moment an avoidant can no longer run from what they feel, both people eventually arrive at the same destination. They come face to face with themselves, their fears, their habits, their wounds, their choices, their growth. And from that point forward, the future depends on one important decision. Will they return to old patterns because those patterns feel familiar, or will they choose growth even when growth feels uncomfortable? That choice changes everything. Sometimes no contact becomes the end of a relationship. Sometimes it becomes the beginning of a healthier one. And sometimes it becomes the moment when a person finally stops searching for answers in someone else and starts finding those answers within themselves. So before you leave, take a moment and ask yourself this question. If no contact forced you to look honestly at your own patterns, what truth did it reveal about you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear about your experience. If you enjoyed this video and found value in these insights, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need to hear this message today. Your support helps us create more content about attachment styles, human behavior, relationship psychology, and emotional growth. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the silence that feels like an ending is actually the beginning of understanding everything more clearly than ever before. The empath cannot truly heal by simply waiting for the avoidant to return. The avoidant cannot truly grow just because they start missing the empath. Both people must face themselves. Both must take responsibility for their own emotional development. Only then can the possibility of a different future begin to appear. Whether that future involves reconciliation or permanent separation becomes less important, because the greatest transformation is not what happens between the two people. It is what happens inside them. As both continue moving through this period of silence, reflection, and emotional discovery, the answers they once searched for in each other slowly begin appearing within themselves, and this sets the stage for the final truth about what no contact ultimately reveals. When an empath and an avoidant both go no contact, the journey rarely unfolds exactly as most people expect. The empath usually experiences the pain first. The silence feels heavy. The questions seem endless. The loss feels impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the avoidant may experience relief first. The pressure disappears. The distance feels comfortable. The emotional intensity seems to be gone. But as more time passes, the story begins changing. The empath slowly starts finding clarity where confusion once existed. They begin seeing the relationship for what it truly was, instead of only seeing what they hoped it could become. They stop chasing answers and begin discovering themselves. At the same time, the avoidant starts facing something they may have spent years trying to avoid: absence, reflection, and emotion. What once felt freeing can begin revealing feelings that can no longer remain hidden behind distance. And that is why no contact can be so powerful. Not because it guarantees reconciliation, not because it guarantees closure, and not because it magically changes another person. Its real power comes from revealing the truth about the relationship, the truth about the patterns, and most importantly, the truth about ourselves. Because the moment an empath stops chasing, and the moment an avoidant can no longer run from what they feel, both people eventually arrive at the same place. They come face to face with themselves, their fears, their habits, their wounds, their choices, their growth. From that point forward, the future depends on one important decision. Will they return to old patterns simply because those patterns feel familiar, or will they choose growth even when growth feels uncomfortable? That decision can change everything. Sometimes no contact becomes the end of a relationship. Sometimes it becomes the beginning of a healthier relationship. And sometimes it becomes the moment when a person finally stops searching for answers in someone else and starts discovering those answers within themselves. So before you leave, take a moment and ask yourself this question. If no contact forced you to honestly look at your own patterns, what truth did it reveal about you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear about your experience. If you found value in this video and enjoyed these insights, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need to hear this message today. Your support helps us create more content about attachment styles, human behavior, relationship psychology, and emotional growth. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the silence that feels like an ending is actually the beginning of understanding everything more clearly than you ever could before.